This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Say it ain't so, Chris. Say it ain't so. Baseball is the national pastime. We love to spend an afternoon with friends and family watching the hometown team knock out line drives. But there is a very dark side to baseball. And Chris and I are going to take a swing at one of the darkest periods in baseball history, probably the darkest, the 1919 Black Sox scandals. At the end of World War I, one of the most talented teams to ever step on the baseball diamond made a deal to throw the World Series. Now, you might not be interested in baseball or baseball history, but I think you should stick around because we are not going to be dissecting stats, hits, ERAs, and RBIs. We're going to dig in some of the deeper issues that surround this unbelievable and still to this very day controversial event. Are you ready for this one, Chris?
Yeah, you'd mentioned this movie a couple of times in our conversations, and I didn't really know too much about it. Like I knew about there was a World Series fix, and I knew Shoeless Joe Jackson, but other than that, I was kind of going into it blind. And it was interesting. I had very strong opinions after watching the movie the very first time, and then I listened to the book, and then I started doing some of my own research just about this whole event, and it was quite a journey from my initial opinion on the matter to the one I kind of have now after, a couple of weeks of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting take on it because really, in a lot of ways, I think how the whole scandal evolved is really follows your evolution in this. And that's really almost the way I think that people wanted you to understand it, but we'll get into all of that. And I think that the real crux of the issue is this is a story about gambling in baseball and just gambling in general. And I think it's probably we're going to use the movie 8 Men Out and the book 8 Men Out by Elliot Asanoff as kind of our base. But there's a lot of other sources that have really developed since then. One is SABR, which is the Society for American Baseball Research. They are connected in some way to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and they have tons and tons of data, and they've been working really in the past just couple of years and really blowing up a lot of the common myths that were around the 1919 series. Now, without getting into too many details, Chris, do you maybe want to lay out some of the basic facts of this whole story?
Yeah, so so leading up to the World Series, a group of players started thinking about wanting to fix the World Series and talking to gamblers. Now, that might seem like a little weird to you, but at the time, it wasn't all that uncommon. Like gambling and baseball were pretty synonymous with one another. It was kind of like a dirty little secret that nobody talked about. And one of the players, Chick Landell, basically was good friends with the pretty predominant gambler, Sports Sullivan, and he comes up with this idea of, well, if you can get $100,000 together, I can get 8 players to agree to throw the World Series for you, and we divvy out the money amongst ourselves, and that's how the movie starts, right?
Yeah, and that's where the whole story starts. Is the players initiated the fix. They looked for money to support them in throwing the series, which, like you said, was not a very big, it was an issue, but it was not a huge issue in that it happened a lot before this time in the 1920s. And you got to figure that baseball really didn't become professional as such until just after the U.S. Civil War. So baseball is very young at this point.
I mean, some of it stemmed from players feeling like they were being paid enough in comparison to how much the owners were bringing in at this time. And we can get into that a little bit later. I mean, there's a case to be made there, I think, to a degree, but I mean, it's just an easy way to make some quick money, right? What made this one different is where teams would be willing to maybe throw a game or two. These guys were going to throw the World Series for the whole world to see, and I think it was just a bridge too far.
Yeah, there was another player who even may have had something to do with this, is Hal Chase, where he was just an inveterate gambler. He was gambling constantly on games and throwing games. And that was probably one of the biggest problems, is throwing games, or I guess you might say juicing the games, sort of, or goosing them to change the odds. So you might throw a little bit of the game to just push the odds in the favor to the gamblers a little bit. So it was a very scummy, but in a way, it was kind of, like you were saying, an accepted part of the game.
Yeah, Hal Chase is, this is what people kind of, I think they misunderstand with the players going to the gamblers talking about fixing the World Series. Like, Hal Chase had been caught like numerous times and was still playing professional baseball. And at this time, I think he was playing for the New York Giants. Some little baseball history for you. The Giants used to play in New York. And he'd been caught like numerous times gambling. So like, from the player's perspective, they're probably looking at it like, well, this guy's been caught and this guy's been caught, and nothing's really happened all that much. You know, this seems to be like a low risk, high reward and, endeavor. But like I pointed out earlier, the difference is I don't think Hal Chase ever tried to like throw the World Series. He might have thrown a game or two. What these guys were undertaking was, far greater.
Another thing I think that I didn't fully understand before going into this was, in baseball history, how young baseball history was, in that it was really just maybe a generation into being really a truly professional sport. It was really, in a lot of ways, the first professional sport, especially the American League and the National League. The American League didn't exist for more than a couple of years before this point, of which the White Sox were a member of the American League. They had really just what you might call the major leagues had just really formed. And it was, before this point, a mishmash of local leagues. And it really harkens back, I think, to a lot of what we had talked about in The Wrestler.
Yeah.
And in wrestling history, a mishmash of different regional leagues. And then it's starting to coalesce into a national league.
Yeah, and during my research too, like what we're watching is what we would watch and we would recognize as baseball. But it wasn't that long ago that apparently at one point you could just throw the ball at the person running at the bases, and that was considered an out. And there was like no strikes at one point, like really bizarre rules. I'm like, how did you ever play this game? And it was not that long ago, so it's still pretty early, and we find out they're still figuring out the rules too at the time. One of the reporters tells Seacott that they're going to take away your shine ball. They're going to take away your spit ball. And a shine ball, and I actually had to do a little bit of research on this. They would used to throw some resin on the ball. So when you would throw it, it would just give it a slight, I don't know, like a little bit more weight, and the ball would move weird. And the spitball, I think, is literally like they would spit on the ball and it would give the pitchers a different kind of grip. And yeah, they outlawed it, which is, you pointed out something weird too, though, when they eventually did outlaw it, a couple pitchers were allowed to keep on using the pitch because it was considered, well, if we take that away from them, they won't be able to pitch anymore.
Yeah, that's really weird. And it really is. It's right after this 1919 World Series that everything in baseball changed. They divide baseball into the dead ball era and the live ball era, and we're very much in the live ball era now. Really, before 1920, there weren't a lot of home runs. A big home run hitter might only hit 5 home runs in a year. In an entire season. And it was really after this time when things like the shine ball and the resin ball, and they started using, they alluded to it in the movie, where they started using a baseball that was more tightly woven together, that they could really crack it out of the park. And then along with those rule changes, we see that the whole league had been reorganized as well to be tighter. Yeah. So we see that this really, the 1919 season was a huge break from a really, you could almost say an antique period into the modern period.
Yeah, for sure. People like Babe Ruth really definitely like ushered in the modern baseball, what we would consider baseball, right? Because it's weird, like when you're watching this game and watching the movie, and you see some of these scores, and Cincinnati scores like 4 runs in an inning, and everyone's like, "Oh, the game's over." You don't realize, like, yeah, the game's over. Like, they're not scoring 4 runs. Because another thing too is one of the made it so difficult for the batters to hit the ball is they would reuse the ball as much as possible, as much as they possibly could during the game. So, depending on the field or if the grass is muddy or what have you, you could be throwing the ball and the batter could literally not see the ball because it'd just be dirt and spit and resin or whatever was on it. 4 runs would be, nail in the coffin. Nowadays, 4 runs is nothing.
I think it's really interesting too that right before this period, baseball had really been brought into an entirely new period by one of the main characters of the whole saga, Charles Comiskey, the owner of the Chicago White Sox. He wasn't just some fat cat who owned the team. He wasn't a magnate of gum like Wrigley on the north side of Chicago, and he wasn't a coal magnate or something. He came up in baseball, and he invented in a lot of ways how baseball is played to this day, of double plays and all these different things, that he was the one who innovated them. So he really truly understood baseball, because in a lot of ways he created baseball.
Yeah, I was thinking about this during the week too. Kami kind of reminds me of Vince McMahon in some ways, where like he grew up with baseball. Vince McMahon didn't wrestle. Kami actually did play baseball, but took all these huge risks to grow the sport. A lot of people don't. In the movie, he's depicted as like this kind of fat cat who's got all this cash, but he had a lot of money. Don't get me wrong, but he took all the risks. He built Comiskey Stadium with his own money. Nowadays, if your sports franchises will threaten to leave if they don't have, taxpayer dollars help them build their stadiums. Yeah. At the time, the stadiums were not what they are now, but Comiskey built that whole thing with his own money. He built the team that we see in the movie too. He scouted Shoeless Joe, Buck Weaver, all these guys, because he had the passion of wanting to win the World Series, as many times as possible, which is what any ball player, realistically, maybe minus these guys, as they threw the game for a couple of bucks, but, any professional athlete wants to, win the championship. And Comiskey, I don't think ever stopped being that person.
So to set the scene really, and to set the stage for 1919, the World War I, the Great War, had just ended pretty much, and baseball and most sports and other entertainment activities had more or less shut down during World War I. And a lot of these players, they were forced to go either join the army or work in war industries. And So coming out of that, this 1919 season, people are starting to feel good again. They've got some dough to throw around. The White Sox they rock the whole season, and they come in, and the standard telling of the story is that really they all felt that they were severely underpaid compared to what Comiskey was bringing in the box office in ticket sales, and compared to what other players who they all felt were of inferior quality, I guess you might say, what they were getting paid. And so that's the reason why they felt that they were, if you kind of put it in the whole progressive era, that they were factory workers that were getting screwed by the boss. And it isn't, in a way, that's how you kind of came in understanding it, that this was a management versus a labor issue. Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History and many other great shows. Go to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now, here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, well, in the movie, it really, that seems, and even in the book, that's the theme where, Kami was underpaying these guys and wasn't paying out their bonuses properly and rewarded them with flat champagne after winning the pennant. I don't think people like winning the pennant in baseball is extremely difficult. It's not an easy feat. And that's how it's depicted in the movie. So I just assume, I assume they're not lying about this. And I came away with the conclusion, I'm like, I'm surprised this didn't happen earlier. This is what this is what was going on. But upon further research, it's really not true. Seacott is the main focus in terms of being disappointed with his pay. He's the most interesting character in this out of the players, in my opinion. Well, he's one of them, but in the movie, they focus a lot on him and Buck Weaver. Seacott apparently was supposed to get a $10,000 bonus if he got to 30 wins. In the movie, and in the book, it's depicted as Kami told the manager, Kid Gleason, to bench him for X amount of weeks so he couldn't get to the 30 wins. But upon further research, that really wasn't the case. He just simply lost the game where he could have got to the 30 wins, and Kami did pay him a bonus. I believe it was like $3,000 or something like that. So it's not like he didn't get anything. And from my research, he was the second highest paid pitcher in the league. I think the only guy that made more than him was, I'm blanking on his name right now, but I know he pitched for the Washington Senators, and he was considered, if not the greatest pitcher that's ever played the game of baseball.
Oh, Johnson. Yeah. One of the best pitchers of all time. And Seacott at that point was really good at the time, but he certainly wasn't one of the best pitchers of all time. And he was more or less, his arm was running out of steam. He was still really good. He was still able to win games, but he really needed that rest time at the end of the season. If he was going to pitch and have a good series, he could not. He was going to blow out his arm if he kept throwing.
And in the movie, they don't make it clear too that this most World Series are 7 games, but this one's 9. I guess the owners wanted to make a couple extra bucks extending the series, coming off the money that they lost from, the war, right? People weren't showing up to the games as much. That was another thing, and the owners were worried about is, are people going to be coming back to baseball? But, that's a tangent. The 9 games were going to be played consecutively. So as soon as they finished a game in Chicago, they would take a train and go right to Cincinnati and then play the game the next day, right? So you'd be sleeping on trains. And Seacott would be pitching at least 3 to 4 games in that series for a guy who was 35 and had had a relatively long career in baseball. I would, if I'm managing the team, I'm saying, no, you're taking the rest, buddy.
Yeah, he was going to have to start 3 games in that series. I think that there's no other reason to say that he was going to be, you'd have to bench him so that he wasn't going to just kill himself And like you said, he did get something of a raise or of a bonus. I think one thing to really point out is, as much as they were moaning about how poorly they were paid, like even if we ignore in the book and in the movie, they make a really big point of all these people who they felt were inferior players to them were getting paid a lot more, which is, it's not true, but let's just set that aside for a moment. Even the money that they were making was still 6 to 7 times as much as what a regular laborer made. And they're only working basically 180 days or 150 odd days a year. I mean, you can't complain too much. And I think that to me, listening to it and watching the movie, I really, once I went and looked at those statistics, because that's the first thing that came to my mind, they kind of show it. Buck Weaver is living in a kind of a rundown apartment, and you can tell he's not living in the best of the neighborhoods in the movie. But I wanted to really know, what did that really equate to? The $5,000-$6,000 a year. It was not bad money. It's not A-Rod compared to what I make. That's it, where he's making hundreds of times what I'm making, maybe thousands of times. It wasn't that big of a disparity, but these guys were not hurting and in the least bit.
Yeah, well, yeah, 100%, right? They were all making really good money at the time, and they're playing baseball, and maybe sometimes some of these guys would work jobs in the off season. I know Chick he used to do boxing because he was a tough guy, and I think Buck Weaver worked at a factory or something in the off season. But I mean, up until historically speaking, recently that was fairly common. Like, you would do sports report and during the season, then you would go and work back at the factory, and that was you'd make a fair amount of money playing the sport. It's only until recently where it was, these guys are making, gazillion dollars to play sports.
Yeah, I think I've shared this in previous episodes. When I was in high school, the star center for the Buffalo Bills, when they won AFL championships in the 60s, he was a substitute teacher in my high school.
Yeah.
He didn't make he made a decent amount of money, but I think a lot of these guys, they just worked. They wanted, they weren't the type of people to just sit on their butts during the off season. They were, a lot of them, even Chick was a skilled, I think he was a pipe fitter or a boiler maker or something. It was a very different age back then. And
Chick.
They were,
oh, sorry. Yeah. Chick, he was a plumber.
Yeah, and they were, and they weren't strength training over the off season or doing any sort of things like that. If they were going to keep honing their baseball skills, they'd work in one of the winter leagues. But they weren't these were not the type of people who were just going to not work during the off season. So I think you can't say that they had to work to be able to eat or something like that.
Oh, no, it's just, I mean, people do it nowadays. Like, even if you're just working like, labor jobs where it's not on like in my industry or different type, like roofers, right? It's really busy in the summertime, but then there's no work. So you plow in the wintertime. It's just, they're not roofing. They're just playing baseball.
Yeah.
So.
And I think that really those are the things that to me started chipping away at the whole narrative that this was the standard labor versus management issue. And when you look and you're like, well, wait a minute. Yeah, labor, and maybe they're not getting the best deal on earth, but they're still making 7 times the amount of a regular laborer. They're not doing that badly. Yeah,
100%, especially when you start diving into when you start comparing the salaries. I think it was recently the Major League Baseball donated to the Baseball Hall of Fame player contracts. And this is how we were able to find that, Eddie Seacott wasn't like terribly underpaid at all. And neither was Chick, and neither was Sweesberg and Happy Felch and all these players that were part of the only player that you could argue that was maybe underpaid was Shoeless Joe, just considering he was the best player, you could argue, in baseball at the time.
Yeah, I mean, when they broke down, and you can go to that Saber website, SABR, and they really break it down. Cecott, like you were saying, was the second highest paid pitcher, and just about every single one of the players who were in on the fix were either the second or the third highest paid player for their position. And you take it all together, and I believe they said that the Chicago White Sox had the second highest payroll of any team in baseball, just after the Yankees. And the Yankees, as in time immemorial, threw all the money in the world at the team. So you can really look at it that they were a very well-funded team. It wasn't like Comiskey was, I mean, there's all sorts of things, like he supposedly didn't pay for the cleaning of their uniforms, but there's no evidence to any of that. And the whole flat champagne as their bonus, that's complete. There's no evidence that actually happened. That was just another one of these stories that happened. But if you just look at the numbers that are, straight out from their actual contracts, they were not making bad money, and they were not making bad money compared to their peers.
Yeah, and another one of them was apparently Kami would give out $2 a day for meal allowance, or other teams gave out $3 a day. And it's okay, so the $1, that's enough to throw the entire World Series. Even if it's true, I don't even know if that's true, but that's what I've been told or read.
Yeah, I think that once you start looking at that, the whole idea of that they had some righteous, the players had some righteous, righteous goal for throwing the series, that they were going to really put it to the man. I hate to name names, but I'm going to say it is the drunk history version of this. If you go to YouTube and they make Chick Gandil out as some sort of proto-Marxist, some sort of Marxist hero, it's complete nonsense. And they should almost really be ashamed of themselves for putting that out there, because it goes against all of the research that's been done. And I think that as we're moving forward, this was pure greed on the part of a couple of players, and we'll start building out the fixed players from this point onward. But it starts off, I think, purely out of greed.
Yeah, I know. Just say in defense of, some people who might have that kind of interpretation of the events is, I mean, Asimov's book was considered the gospel truth for however long, until this new information started coming forward and people just accepted it. And I always thought was kind of weird, because from the gambler's perspective, he's getting all his information from one of the gamblers, and the players, he's not, I don't know, just right off the bat, I don't know, it seems like it was kind of sloppily researched.
Yeah, I think the new research on it, even the newer researchers, they don't want to really throw Asimov under the bus, because he really was from a different time, and he really wasn't writing an academic research as such. He was really writing this book in a very different time. He put fictionalized characters in the book, and that was a common thing that writers did at that time to, in a way, protect their copyright on the material that they were writing. And so it really was a very different time when he wrote the book. And I don't want to, I wanted to jump down Asimov's throat, but I think that in a way he was writing a book in his time, for his times, with the material he had, and he probably did the best that he could given the resources that he had. And you also have to remember, he wasn't that far from the events. A lot of the players and the people involved were still alive when he was doing his research.
Yeah, and he probably was asking for stuff like, oh, can I, get a pay stub of Eddie Cecott? And he was probably got no's. I can't see him not asking for stuff like that, and he probably wasn't able to get his hands on that type of information, I assume.
I think it's a good. Let's start focusing in on the fix now. And Oscar Happy Felch, he was the center fielder, and he was a very prominent player at his time, and he was involved in the fix. And he had a quote. He said, "Well, the beans are spilled, and I think I'm through with baseball. I got $5,000. I could have got just about that much by being on the level if the Sox had won the series. And now I'm out of baseball, the only profession I know anything about, and a lot of gamblers have gotten rich. The joke seems to be on us." And I really think that to me, that quote really stuck with me, because the players, for the most part, really got the rough end of the pineapple, so to speak. And the players were the ones who initiated it, particularly Chick and Cecott. Those were I guess that was the nucleus. They're the ones who organized this whole thing.
Yeah. And Happy Felch he's 100% right. Chick is the one who organized it, and Cecott, if he didn't give it its approval, never would have happened. Roy Schock mentioned too, he was the catcher. He was the guy that was not part of any of this. He was playing the game straight. He had mentioned if there was a pitcher, Red Faber, who played for the White Sox, he actually had influenza this season. He had said, like, if he wasn't sick, none of this would have been able to happen. I'm just kind of making an example just how important pitchers were, because it is true. If Cecott said, like, I don't want any part of this, none of this would have happened. They wouldn't have been able to pull it off.
That was really, I think that was the key part, that because Chick really fancied himself as a small-time hood. I think you even get that. One of the major sources of information is I can't remember the dates. It's sometime in the 50s, I believe, Sports Illustrated article that Chick wrote. And he basically gave his side of the story after the fact. And I really, even through that, I think you get that Chick thought he was a small-time gambler, and that, or a small-time hood and gambler, and that he could really control this whole thing. And you look at it within the players of the classic 8 men out. You had Chick and Cecott, who were really the nucleus of it, and they pulled in Lefty Williams, who was one of the other starting pitchers. And they needed, like you were saying, Cecott that was really good to have Cecott, but they needed another one of the pitchers in there, or else they weren't going to throw it, because the pitcher really did control the whole throwing. You couldn't really fix the game entirely without having the pitchers. Then Swede Risberg, who was the shortstop, he was really involved. Lefty Williams, Fred McMullen, who was a second stringer infielder. Then you roll in Buck Weaver and Shoeless Joe are kind of involved in it, but they're on the periphery. And so it kind of just keeps going out and out and out of how much involvement each of these players had in it. The closer you get to Chick and Cecott, the more you are in the fix. Happy Felch, he definitely took money. So of the players, about 7 of them definitely took money. Buck Weaver, who got caught up in all of this, he didn't take money, and he never claimed to have been in the fix. He just happened to be at some of the meetings that they had. And my feeling is, with all of this, it was all very ham-fistedly done by Chick of getting the big money involved. And I just felt that the money was, and the plan was just not very well done. I think there was a lot of hubris on Chick's part of this whole thing.
Yeah, it comes across in the movie that it's not very well planned out, and Chick and the players are taking this massive risk based on promises that are being made to them from people's entire careers about being dishonest to other people. Like Cecott is the only one that seems to have couple brain cells demanding, I want the money before I throw the game. The other players are the other players are like, well, okay, we'll throw the game, and the gamblers are telling them, well, we got to wait till the bets come in, and then you'll get your money then. And by the time you're already throwing the games, you're in.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do? You're going to call the cops? There's nothing you can do about it. They all should have just been, we want the $100,000 right now, right this second, before we do anything. And that's not what happened at all. But the nature of the whole gambling conspiracy is all messy itself too. There's many different players involved in it, and they're all kind of playing off each other. There's a great scene in the movie in the hotel room. I believe it's after the second game, and all these people are knocking on each other's doors, and there's different gamblers talking to different other gamblers, and players talking to other players, and Kit Gleason's trying to talk to Kwame about like how there's a fix going on, and it just really kind of like captures the craziness of this gambling fix, where there's so many different moving parts and nobody really knows for sure what's going on. Even Happy Felch he didn't know for sure that the plan was to throw the entire World Series. He thought it was just a couple games.
I think that's really what you get to the point to, is that it was really only Chick who knew the whole story, because he was the one who was organizing it. And I believe that the plan was that each of the players would get $10,000 cash money, which to me, and maybe we could talk about each player of what that 10,000 really meant to them. If they won the series, they were going to get almost $5,000 in a bonus, at least $5,000. Yeah. It was very close to $5,000, and it potentially could have been more. So they were really just getting more or less double their bonus or a year's pay, more or less, from throwing this. And for your money, if you're one of the 8 men, would you take that?
I wouldn't have accepted it. I would have just won the World Series. Like it just doesn't seem, the risk is not, it's just not worth it. But I guess we'd have to look back at, we pointed out earlier, where people had been caught for gambling before and nothing really much had happened. I just think these guys were, you pointed out, like hubris, not realizing, well, guys, this isn't just a game or two. You're trying to throw the World Series. This is going to be an issue. And they were really ham-fisted about how they went about throwing the World Series too. Like Seacott was not very subtle about, playing terribly. And Chick was, they depicted in the movie where he's running the bases, and it's just very obvious what's happening. And Seacott like cutting off a throw, and Happy Felch like missing a catch. It's just very obvious, because not like they were going to get the $5,000. It was virtually guaranteed they were going to get the $5,000, because the Cincinnati Reds were just not that good of a baseball team in comparison to the White Sox. There was just this, maybe the fix might have worked if the teams were somewhat comparable, but they really weren't, because ask anybody, can you name a player that was on that Cincinnati Reds team? You wouldn't be able to name a single person.
If you were really hardcore into baseball history, you might know one of them.
Yeah. Or like the Chicago White Sox, or that team was considered one of the greatest teams ever assembled. Like Shoeless Joe Jackson is a household name. Seacott might be pushing it a little bit, but I mean, if you're somebody who knows a little bit about baseball, you know who Seacott is, and Buck Weaver's famous because we'll get into that a little bit later.
I mean, really, if you look at it, every single one of those 8 players would 100% be a Hall of Famer, and that's of the Black Sox, of the team, of the players that were in some way involved in the fix. And I think just about every one of the players who were not involved in the fix, the so-called clean Sox, are all Hall of Famers. Schalk is in the Hall of Fame. Collins, the second baseman, is in the Hall of Fame. I think Kid Gleason's in the Hall of Fame. I mean, this team was really in all, maybe one of the best teams that's ever been put together in professional sports.
Yep. Yeah. From what I've read, that seems to have been the case.
It's funny. I was reading something that said that a lot of the players on that Cincinnati team to the day they died stuck to the fact that saying how they were rated and that they really were as good. And they feel that they won a lot of the players on that team thought that they would have won that clean, which I think that it's anything that you see of the statistics when the White Sox showed up to play, they absolutely destroyed Cincinnati. It was like they weren't even on the field.
Yes. I mean, as I get it from their perspective, because that's the thing is the Black Sox, the White Sox, the gamblers, the people that fixed the game, they betrayed the Cincinnati Reds because yes, officially they're known as the World Series champs, but it's always going to be in the back of your head. Like, did we actually really win that World Series? And clearly they didn't, but it wasn't fair to them. They showed up to play and they should have been given the opportunity on a level playing field to at least try their best against this team, even if they probably didn't really stand a chance.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Now, it's so complicated just with the players. You have the players who organized the fix, then you have the players who were definitely involved in the fix, and players who took money but really didn't think there was a real fix. Like Shoeless Joe Jackson's a perfect example. He took money, but he really didn't do anything to throw the game. There's no real evidence that he did anything to throw the game. He had a great batting average. I think he had a home run in the game and the series. I think some have said that he did really well on non-fixed days that they don't think were fixed and days that they know were fixed. But I don't know, that to me, that wasn't 100% convincing. And I think that the scholars and the historians aren't 100% convinced on that either.
Yeah, he had a record. I think it was 12 hits in a World Series that stood for, I think it was almost 50 years. So if you were trying to throw the game, you didn't really do a very good job at it. And they touch on that in the movie too, where Lefty Williams drops his payoff to Shoeless Joe, and Lefty says to him, "Oh, can you just play a little bit worse out there, Joe? Can you do that for us?" And Joe just kind of like shrugs him off. And Shoeless Joe was not involved in any of these meetings.
No, not a single one
at all. Not a single one. He didn't talk to any gamblers. He basically got all his information via Lefty, who was was the other Southerner on the team. That's a interesting thing that they show in the movie too. Was there's the divide between the Northern players and the Southern players to a degree, and you think, oh, that seems a little weird, but at the time that this happened, you're not that far removed from the Civil War, really. So that's still fresh in a lot of people's memories. And from my understanding, Joe didn't really talk to a ton of the other guys. He just talked to Lefty. Lefty was his best friend. And Lefty got all his information from Chick, who got all his information from Sleepy Burns, who got all his information from Abe Attell. So, it's like a broken telephone almost going all the way. Yeah, and I know for everything that I read from Joe is, I don't know why he took the money, because he wasn't trying to throw it at all. The only thing I can think of is the reason they involved Joe in the first place is the people funding the whole operation said, well, if Joe's not part of it, we don't want any, we're not going to go along with the plan, because at the time Joe was considered the best baseball player in the world.
They really make a big deal about Joe in that he didn't participate in any meetings. He did take money. I wonder what you thought and what impression you get, because you can get a different impression from every single person you listen to. Joe was known, he couldn't read, he couldn't write. And he was a Southerner from the absolute backwaters. So he wasn't a very worldly guy either at that time. And people basically thought he was dumb as dirt. And that's how they treated him. And I wonder, what impression did you take of Joe from reading and what you thought, because I think your perspective could be very different from mine, and all of our perspectives could be different from everybody else's, because I think everybody has their own read on Joe.
I just think Joe was a very simple person in the sense of, if a friend told you something, you just like, your friend's not going to say something to you, lying to you on purpose. What your friend says to you, he's telling you the truth and he's looking out for your best interests, which is all the information that Joe got came from Lefty, who was his best friend, about the gambling fix. And almost kind of like a child, in a sense, where a child has a difficult time understanding that people in authority or a friend would lie to them for personal gain. I just don't think Joe could really process that Lefty would do something like that to him or his other friends, and thought he was just being a good friend. You're asking me to do this, no problem, Lefty. You're my best friend in the world. That's the impression I got. So
I had that impression, but then there were certain things that Shoeless Joe did that really I couldn't wrap my mind around. I think first and foremost with everything with Joe is all he wanted to do is play baseball, and he really did not care about anything else. And I think that I 100% agree with you that he wanted to be 100% loyal to his friends, and his friends were the ones who were in on the fix. And he initially wasn't going to rat them out, but then there's some evidence that he tried to talk to Comiskey, and Comiskey wouldn't even talk to him. I think that nobody respected Joe outside of him swinging a bat. And I think that was probably his problem.
And it shows in the movie that Joe is struggling with the information that he has about what's going to go down. In the first game, Joe's telling Kid Gleason he doesn't want to play, and Kid Gleason, loses on him, saying, well, what are you talking about? You're going to play, Joe. And I think maybe that Kid Gleason maybe that might be the first sign that Kid's like, what's going on here? Joe doesn't want to play baseball. This is all this guy does is play baseball. In the World Series on top of it.
I really do think that Joe was incredibly conflicted about this, and he didn't know what to do. And I think of myself in the same position if I was in Joe's position, or Buck Weaver, because Buck Weaver was in a very similar position. These guys were his buddies, and the team was completely bifurcated into two camps that hated each other's guts long before all of this happened. The Collins, Shock part of the team. I think Dickie Kerr was in that. I mean, we're throwing out a lot of names, but you almost can't avoid in this that there's a lot of names involved in this. But if you really boil it down, there was two teams, a more working class part of the team of Gandil and Weaver and Seacott. And then you had, and they really bonded with each other, especially against that other team where Collins, he was a rich kid I think he was from somewhere in Boston, and he played for Ivy League colleges baseball. They hated each other. And I think that if you were in that position and all your buddies are taking this fix, do you go and squeal on them to management? Do you go tell the principal?
It's a tough decision to make, right? Like you pointed out, these are all your friends doing it, and I don't know, like if I'm Buck Weaver in particular, I don't know what I would do, to be honest with you. I tend to think I would say something, but I can't say for sure unless I'm in that situation exactly what I would do. There's a part of me that would be, yeah, for sure I'm going to say something, because I'm going to get dragged into all this nonsense with all these guys, and it's not going to look good on me.
Yeah, there's so many layers, because somebody like Shoeless Joe, what did Shoeless Joe really know if he hasn't been in any of the meetings? He doesn't know anything. All he has is rumors. I think that's what sets him against Bucky Weaver, in that Weaver was kind of they were opposites of each other. Shoeless Joe had no flipping clue what was really happening, because he never went to a single meeting, but he took money. Buck Weaver knew everything that was going on because he had gone to many of the meetings, but he never took a dime. I think in a lot of ways, Buck Weaver had more of a responsibility to go tell than Shoeless Joe, because what's Shoeless Joe going to say? Well, in the locker room, they're saying, and Lefty's saying this and Lefty's saying that, but he has no real actionable information.
Yeah, 100%. Like Bucky Weaver knew, I don't know how much of everything that he knew, but he knew enough that the World Series is being fixed. And it really wouldn't have made a lick of difference if he played as hard as he could, which he did in this series. I believe he batted like 315 and had a couple RBIs and a bunch of hits and good defensive plays. But at the end of the day, like, he had all the information to really to split this wide open and tell Kaminsky and tell Kid Gleason or tell somebody else. They didn't have it. Well, they had a commissioner at the time, but it was weird. We'll get into that later. He really could have done it, but I guess he had this misguided sense of loyalty to a lot of his friends on the team, saying, he wanted to be one of the boys. He didn't want to rat them out. But what your boys are doing is throwing the World Series for a couple of bucks, and it's, well, I don't want to say a couple of bucks. It was a lot of money, but at the end, you're going to get dragged into all of it too, because you're in all these meetings. It just, to me, I would have said something.
I think there's something to say that if you were sitting in Buck Weaver or Shoeless Joe's shoes, that you could say to yourself at that point in 1919, well, hey, I didn't really know anything. Either Shoeless Joe, what do I really know? I don't know anything. Before he took the money. Once he took the money, he really had to say something. But if you believe what the books said, Comiskey wouldn't even talk to him. And then with Weaver saying, well, hey, I didn't take any of this money and I played my heart out during this whole thing. I think you could, both of them in their minds, you could play it out like, I have some insulation from this, that how can you really drag me into all of this when I had nothing to do with it. And I think that's what I think in 1919, that's where they were sitting.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say it's weird. I would say Bucky's the more that I think about it, that Bucky's more guilty than Shoeless Joe. I know that sounds bizarre because Shoeless Joe took the money, but in actuality, Bucky knew the whole story and didn't say anything. Joe didn't know anything. Yeah. He was just kind of going along with what the boys were doing, I guess, and just playing baseball like he always did.
Now, moving forward, and I think you could really say that both of them could insulate themselves from the real hardcore people. And at least that they, not that they, from an outsider perspective, 100 years later, you could say that they probably didn't have any insulation, but I think in their situation, you could see how you could think that through, that that they've isolated themselves from the real conspiracy.
Yeah, 100%. Like Bucky and Joe are not really part of the conspiracy. I mean, even Roy Schock even said it wasn't 8 men out; it was 7. Yeah, because he didn't include Bucky Weaver as part of the 8, because he knew that Bucky didn't take a dime and he was trying 110% the entire series.